Good afternoon for the last and final session of the 2020 AMS Washington Forum. But just because it's last doesn't mean it's not going to be awesome. So I'm glad you're here today. Wanted to give a brief bio as I get started. The session is called Truth and Science, Scientific Integrity in the Public Sphere, Mistrust, Rumors, and Risk. And it's going to be moderated by two of my favorite people in this entire community. First is Heidi Santola, who's been my partner in crime the last few years in running these Washington Forum meetings. Heidi has served as Senior Account Executive, Agribusiness of IBM, Weather Business Solutions, AI Applications since March of 2018. She is responsible for helping facilitate and grow strategic partnerships in agribusiness. Prior to joining IBM, Heidi gained more than 15 years experience in professional meteorology and business development. She most recently served as a Senior Business Development Manager for Schneider Electric Cloud Services, otherwise known as DTN, where she facilitated strategic partnerships with internally and externally to aid in the growth of the energy management and sustainable business through organic innovation and custom weather solutions for segments such as retail and healthcare. Heidi holds a bachelor's degree in meteorology with a minor in technical math and mathematics from Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. She's the past chair of the AMS Board on Enterprise Economic Development and past chair of the AMS Energy Committee. She also served on the board of directors for the Weather Risk Management Association and an active member of the AMS Financial Weather Risk Management Committee. Gina Esco, my partner in crime at NOAA. Gina is a social scientist and risk communication expert supporting NOAA's Weather Program Office as the WPO Social Science and Forecasting Continuum of Environmental Threats, otherwise known as FACETS, programs. Gina's focus is on prioritizing social and behavioral science research needs within the weather community, determining ways to translate social science research into application, and learning from operational meteorologists and practitioners to understand the next research challenge. She is an active member of both the AMS as well as the National Weather Association, and is also the 2019 recipient of the AMS Award for Early Career Professional Achievement. Dr. Esco earned her master's and her PhD in weather risk communication from Cornell University and a bachelor's in environmental science and policy from the University of Maryland. It's my pleasure to introduce my two friends, Heidi and Gina. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that amazing introduction. And thank you to Heidi, who called me a few months ago and actually, I think right before the holidays, and said, what are the chances you have time to take on doing a panel, something in relation to the public's trust of science? And I'm so glad she did, because our community is absolutely no stranger to conflicting information or rumors or information that could cause mistrust. If I mention something like highway shark image, I bet many of you are going, I know exactly what that is, as it's among one of the most common, popular false images that are shared on social media post-disaster. And so we know that. So while weather shark has sort of become almost humorous, the effects of conflicting information and rumors on the credibility of science certainly is not. Mistrust in science in general, misleading information on social media, including rumors or inaccurate information, a divided society, and more have become major challenges for the AMS weather, water, and climate community. And as such, we're hoping to create a dialogue here today, exchange some practical challenges, share research knowledge with some leading experts, and begin to learn and exchange ways to maintain, because I do believe we have some trust, to maintain and gain, and in some cases regain, the public's trust surrounding weather, water, and climate topics. So with that, I'd like to hand it to my co-moderator, Heidi Santola, to introduce some of our first speakers. Heidi.
Hey, Gina, thank you. And Jen, thanks for the kind intro as well. So I'm super excited that Gina agreed to host this with me, and I'm equally excited for our STEAM experts. We will be starting with our private sector folks. What I will be doing is doing a brief introduction about Matt and Maureen, and then we'll be asking them to share their stories. So first, I'm going to introduce Matt Lanza. So Matt is a meteorologist and managing editor of Space City Weather in Houston, Texas. Go Astros, right, Matt? Or is it Phillies? Depends on the day, right? That is his job by night, but by day, he's a superhero at Schneider Energy as lead meteorologist. And for those who are curious, he also had a stint in broadcasts back in Syracuse and Utica, New York, and he's a graduate of Rutgers University. Then there's one of my most favorite people, Maureen McCann, who is a broadcast meteorologist at Spectrum News 13 in Orlando, Florida. She has an extensive broadcast bathroom, and I also share the same love for meteorology that started with Hurricane Gloria, even though that might age us, Maureen. Sorry about that. And she also is an atmospheric science degree from Cornell University. And she's got a master's degree, for some of you who might be surprised to hear this, but it's amazing, from Central Florida, where she majored in emergency and crisis management. But another thing that she does by night is she's also the Commissioner of Professional Affairs here at AMS. So I'm so excited to hear from both these wonderful individuals. I want to hand the mic over to Matt to tell a little bit about his stories. Matt, over to you.
All right, Heidi, thank you. Thank you for asking me to come. And there's your shark. I just, couldn't help myself there. So anyway, my name is Matt Lanza, as Heidi said, managing editor for Space City Weather, which is a Houston-based weather blog, Houston, Texas, which I like to tell people is probably one of the most disaster-prone cities in the country, especially in the last, 5, 6, 7 years. We have people that are legitimately trauma filled after what has happened here between the various floods that we've had and some of the other things that are not weather related as well. So I just want to talk about, this is one of the things that I find to be one of the most interesting and pressing situations for our field kind of going forward is maintaining people's trust and maintaining people's ability to understand, the weather story without getting mixed up with bad information. And that's one of the things we sort of pride ourselves on with Space City Weather is we're, we read about the forecast, we give people information, and we try to keep it low key, low hype. We try to be as boring as possible until we have to dial it up, like a Hurricane Harvey situation, which is where my story is. And this is one of the first instances I really had firsthand in dealing with this. In the run up to Hurricane Harvey, there were all kinds of, things being bandied about in terms of rumors, some of which actually did end up being correct, not because they were correct at the time, but because the storm was just that bad. But there was an email that had circulated, I think it was the Wednesday or Thursday before Harvey hit, with respect to Houston, talking about one of the quotes in the email was, quote, "Everything south of Katy is predicted to be devastated." Katy's a western suburb of Houston, about 30 miles away. That wasn't true. That didn't happen. And that, it's just set to panic people. So when you have to deal with that sort of information, that sort of misinformation that comes out ahead of these storms, that creates problems for us because then we can't focus on forecasting. We have to focus on putting out fires and things like that. So it really does make it difficult. It's really a challenge that we have. And one of the texts I think we'll talk about kind of as we go on is I try now to get ahead of those things and answer people's questions before they ask them. That's been one of the staying things that has happened since Hurricane Harvey. It's just changed my entire approach to how not how I forecast, but how I communicate that forecast to people ahead of time. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It should be great.
Thanks, Matt. And I appreciate you sharing your story very honestly and transparently. Maureen, I imagine you can relate really well to Matt's storyline, especially with all that hurricanes that hit Orlando and the Florida area. So welcome your story and your perspective as well from the broadcast meteorology sector.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt. And I wish I had the shark picture because that is the first thing that came to mind when Gina said that during the intro. And I was thinking about that when we think about trust and quality information that we get from viewers. We have that two-way dialogue with viewers now through social media that we get pictures from them. And it really does help tell the weather story when we're able to validate what we're seeing. This is my virtual set right here from our Spectrum News 13 Weather Center in Orlando. No windows in it. So we really do count on those viewer photos to come in to let us know what's happening. So similar to Matt with Harvey, me being in Central Florida, when I was, approached about this panel and I'm thinking about trust and the concepts that we're going to be talking about today, I was drawn to tropical situations as well in recent years, being Matthew and in Irma. And also similar to what Matt said, kind of keeping the dialogue very, very even keeled for the most part. We really take on the no hype approach at our station. We do weather on the ones, weather every 10 minutes for any of you that have a Spectrum station or a similar 24-hour station in your community. You may know you get to see more weather, and you get to see the meteorologist take the time to explain and go into the science a little bit more. And that's what I love about my station, is that I don't have to worry about angry viewers calling in or writing in if you cover up the bottom of the Wheel of Fortune with a crawl, or if you cut into an NCAA basketball game. We get to just be solid weather, especially when it matters, when we're in, severe thunderstorm warnings, tornado warnings, or tropical situations. And I think about how we have this mentality that is all year round, being don't be scared, be prepared. And we can dial that up and kind of change the tone of our dialogue when it counts, when it matters, when we're in a situation that there is a very threatening situation. I think about during Matthew and Irma, those are the only times we've ever seen excessive wind warnings posted for our area. So that's kind of when we can change the tone of how we're talking, but still have that don't be scared, be prepared approach. And we try to build that trust with viewers throughout the year on sunny days. And that kind of crosses over to, Heidi mentioned how I recently earned a master's in emergency and crisis management. And one of the common expressions in the emergency management community and in weather, water, climate as well is, a disaster is not a time to shake hands and trade business cards. You want to build that trust and make those connections and network on blue sky days when you're doing networking, like all of you being here in the Washington Forum, being able to connect with new people so that you know who your trustworthy sources are for when you really do need them, when you get into an actual big weather event or weather emergency. So that's just a little bit about my background. I can definitely talk more about the tropical stuff, but I know we have some great presentations to hear from as well.
Thank you so much, Maureen and Matt, for both of those really lovely overviews. We wanted to set the stage by hearing from some of our community members as we are bringing in two experts here with us today that are outside of our community, which is wonderful that we're bringing them in. But we wanted our experts to hear from our community because our community has expertise in the practice of sort of addressing misinformation. And so some of the really great themes I heard is that trust is two ways. As much as perhaps our publics could lose trust with us, we can also lose trust with them in terms of receiving information. It's a very interesting point. And then, of course, misinformation impacts decision-making, not only for our publics, our core partners, but it also impacts that misinformation impacts the role that we play to communicate that important environmental information, be it weather, climate, ocean, water. And so with that, because we know there are these impacts, we wanted to bring in two experts today that will speak to some of these issues from that public perspective. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. David Rand. And I have to say, earlier this week, we had a talk about the use of social media, and I would like to say that I met David over social media. I happened to see a post of a new article he had out, and I emailed Heidi and said, oh my gosh, we need to meet Dr. David Rand. And so Dr. David Rand is a professor of management science and brain and cognitive sciences at MIT. How wonderful is this? He's the Irwin Shell professor and professor of management science and brain and cognitive sciences at MIT. He bridges the fields of cognitive science, behavioral economics, and social psychology. His research combines behavioral experiments and online field studies with mathematical computation models to understand human decision making. His primary focus is on illuminating why people believe and share misinformation, or what is otherwise known as fake news. So with that, David, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm excited to tell you guys about some work that I've been doing. I think it may actually be easier for me to screen share so that I can advance, if that's, yeah, here. This is, what I do all day, unfortunately. So can everybody see that? Great. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the invitation. Excited to be here and to tell you some about the research that we've been doing about misinformation, particularly online. Sort of although weather misinformation has been around for a long time, as per this sort of intro stories, a lot of this idea of fake news kind of really rose to prominence during the 2016 election with these kinds of blatantly false statements that got huge numbers of shares on social media. There's also been a lot of attention in the context of COVID, where lots of COVID-related misinformation has been spreading online. And so what I try to do in my work is use like a cognitive science perspective to try and understand why is it that people share misinformation in the first place, and therefore, what are things that could potentially be done to reduce the spread of misinformation. And so when we were thinking about, okay, so why are people sharing misinformation? The simplest explanation is that people just can't tell what's true versus inaccurate. And so they're doing their best. They're only sharing things that they think are true, but they're confused. And so to get some insight into how well confusion could account for the misinformation problem, what we did was an experiment where we recruited about 1,000 Americans. We showed them a set of 24 headlines in Facebook format, sort of half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning politically. And for half of the people, when they saw each headline, we asked them, if you were to see this, how would you share it, basically? So we got their sharing intentions. And for the other half of the people, instead, we asked them, is it true or not? And so now we can look for, for each of these two sets of people, we can look at what fraction of headlines people said they would share and what fraction of headlines people said were accurate, based on whether they were actually true in yellow or false in green, and whether they aligned with people's partisanship, and so they were sort of motivated to believe or share them, or misaligned with people's politics. And when you look at accuracy judgments, people are actually doing pretty well. They rated the true headlines as much more accurate than the false headlines, and they only rated the headlines that aligned with their ideology as a bit more accurate than the headlines that didn't. So overall, pretty good. And so if the problem with sharing misinformation is just people not being able to tell what's true from false, then the sharing plot should look pretty similar. But in fact, it looks radically different. In terms of sharing, there's basically no difference between true and false headlines, whereas people are much more likely to share headlines that align with their politics versus headlines that don't. And most striking is if you look at headlines that are false, but aligned with people's politics, people in the sharing condition were twice as likely to say they would share those headlines as the people in the accuracy condition were to rate them as true. And so that means that there is actually a big disconnect between accuracy and sharing. And the problem isn't just that people can't tell. And so obviously this raises the question of why is it that people are sharing content that this suggests they would be able to know was accurate if they looked at it, or rather if they thought about it. And our argument is that much of the problem is that the social media context distracts people. You're scrolling quickly, there's cat videos and baby pictures and news and all this stuff mixed together. So that puts you, even if you're an analytical thinker when you're at work, when you're on Facebook, you're not thinking carefully. And also your attention is focused on all kinds of social things, like how much engagement is this going to get, who said what, so on and so forth, and not focused on how accurate is this. So our proposal is that even though most people don't want to share misinformation, they just forget to stop and think about whether it's true or not. And I, who do research on this as my everyday focus of my life, have made this mistake myself, and I've shared inaccurate stuff by accident just because I forgot to think about it. So if this is right, then it suggests that we should be able to get people to be more discerning in what they share by refocusing their attention on the concept of accuracy. Basically, not telling them what's true and what's false, not telling them you should only share accurate content, but just reshifting their attention. And so we've run a bunch of experiments to show, to support this prediction. But I'm going to tell you in particular about a field experiment that we ran on Twitter, where we found over 5,000 users who had recently retweeted links to Breitbart, a site that produces a lot of misinformation. And we sent them this direct message which just said, showed a random non-political headline and said, how accurate is it? And basically had some text saying, please let us know what you think. Almost nobody responds to the message, but that's fine. They don't need to respond to the message. All they need to do is open it and read that sentence. And essentially they've been treated in the sense that the concept of accuracy has been activated in their mind. And so then the idea is when they click out of our message and go back to their news feed, they'll be more likely to think to themselves, oh, is this thing that I'm looking at true or not? And therefore, they should be more discerning in what they decide to share. And indeed, that's what we find. We find that the message significantly increases the quality of the news links that they share. And to visualize this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 1 dot per news source. The size of the dot is proportional to the number of tweets that people in our subject pool made to that tweet before the experiment started. And then on the x-axis is the quality of the news outlet as rated by professional fact checkers. And on the y-axis is going to be the change in the fraction of tweets that people made to that news source after getting our message. This means positive values means our message increased the share of tweets to that outlet, and negative values means it decreased the share of tweets to that outlet. And again, I should say these people didn't know they were part of an experiment. They are just random Twitter users that got a message from some this like bot account of ours that was not labeled as MIT or science experiment or whatever. And so what we find is this strong positive relationship such that receiving our message increased the quality of what people were sharing. It made them more likely to share things like New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. And most notably, even though we selected these people because they were regular Breitbart sharers, this nudge decreased the fraction of their tweets to Breitbart and Daily Caller, which is another right-leaning hyperpartisan site. This is evidence from this field experiment that these kinds of accuracy prompts can get people to be more discerning in their sharing. And in subsequent work, we've been trying to figure out what are lots of different ways of doing this. We'll try and create like a toolkit that social media platforms, for example, could use to get people to think about accuracy. And so we've shown it works by doing things like what I showed you before, showing people random headlines and asking how accurate they think it is. That makes them more discerning in their subsequent sharing. We've also found that minimal digital literacy tips like this, so think carefully about the news, be skeptical of headlines, investigate the source, et cetera, this makes people more discerning in their sharing. I don't think that this is teaching anyone anything they didn't already know. It's just, again, activating the concept of accuracy. Also, if you just ask people how important it is to only share accurate news, almost everyone will say it's very important or extremely important. And then they go on to pay more attention to accuracy because, again, it's top of mind. And this is even more effective if you also tell people that other people think it's important to only share accurate news, which is true. And so, as I said, we found that these accuracy prompts make people more discerning in their sharing. It works for political news that's both aligned with your partisanship and misaligned with your partisanship. It works for COVID news. It works for both Democrats and Republicans. For the COVID stuff, it works for both people that are concerned about COVID and people who aren't. We recently replicated these results in a 16-country cross-cultural experiment with more than 30,000 participants. And so it seems like a very robust result. And we also robustly find in lots of studies in the US and in the cross-cultural data that people who engage in more thinking, those who are more likely to stop and think, are also, in addition to being more discerning what they share, when you look at their actual ratings of what they believe to be true, also people who engage in more thinking are less likely to believe false claims. So this is all to say, slowing down and thinking, and in particular thinking about accuracy, can really help reduce this belief in and spread of misinformation. And so the proposal is that platforms can do things like this while you're scrolling through your news feed. Every so often, they'll have a pop-up and they'll say, oh, it could be a pop-up or it could be just like a card in feed. Say, help us inform our algorithms. How accurate do you think this random headline is? And even if they threw away the responses, just asking people this question can make them more discerning in their sharing. So this is what we've been doing. And because we're academics, what we do is publish academic papers. So we've written papers about this work, like these ones. But also the reason that I do this is because we're really interested in having an impact in outside the ivory tower. And so to that end, we've been working with tech companies. So TikTok, for example, found out about our work and they implemented some features trying to get people to think about accuracy. They did a test and found it was effective and now built it into their standard platform. We've been working with Google for a couple of years on designing accuracy nudges and getting it sort of tested as part of a variety of Google products. We're in ongoing discussions with Twitter and Facebook. So we hope that will happen, but it's also not just in the hands of platforms. It's also something that other organizations can try and implement by buying ads. So for example, during the election, we worked with a company to make a set of ads based on our research that basically just like get people to think about accuracy. They wound up being so effective that some of our partners spent like millions of dollars buying ads of bad buys, putting these ads on misinformation websites, and found that they got much more engagement than their normal ads, more standard persuasive ads. So this is also something that can be done at scale in that way. So to summarize, most people are not purposely sharing misinformation. And a lot of the reason they're sharing this information is they're just forgetting to think about accuracy. And so if we can just shift their attention back to the concept of accuracy, this is a distributed solution that can help reduce the spread of fake news. Distributed in the sense that it doesn't rely on a centralized definition of true. It doesn't rely on, Facebook going through and flagging things, but instead it takes advantage of people's own ability and desire to tell, basically, does this seem crazy or does this seem reasonable? And so that makes it scalable. It doesn't require keeping up with the news. And also it's amplified by network effects, which is to say that if you don't share something bad, none of your followers see it. And so they don't share it, so none of their followers see it, and so on. So this is a little insight into the psychology of why people share misinformation and what to do about it. And I just want to acknowledge all of the collaborators on this work and our funders. So thanks so much for having me here, and looking forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. We'll hold questions until the end, but I have many, so I hope the audience does too. Thank you. Next, we would like to introduce our second speaker. I admit I did not meet Dr. Meghna Talapragada on Twitter this time. This is a colleague who comes from a similar academic lineage, if you will. Dr. Meghna Talapragada is an assistant professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. Prior to this, she was the Vartan Gregorian Postdoctoral Fellow in the Science of Science Communication program at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She graduated from Cornell University with a PhD in communication. And I should note from the meteorology community, she also went to North Carolina State University, where she got her MS in communication as well. Meghna has a different sort of angle to this, talking about sort of the effects of the war on science on credibility, and sort of a science communication lens to this that is really a nice sort of counter, sort of just a different angle than what David provided. So it's really wonderful that we have two different experts. So Meghna, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gina. And I just wanted to tell people that I've been trying my video on and off, and it's been very, very finicky. So I apologize for internet issues that I'm not able to turn my camera on during the presentation, but I'm hoping that you can all hear me fine and can gauge by how excited I am from my talk. Like, I hope you're able to see that I'm really excited and thrilled to be here. And I'm going to hope that my slides will do that justice as well. So I want to begin with, first on my next slide, just saying how grateful I am for this opportunity to be here, to present, to hear just this conversation. I already feel like I am smarter than I was when I started, attending this panel. So thank you all, and thank you so much for having me here. So as Gina was introducing, and as shown in the next slide, I'm kind of taking a slightly different approach, but I think in the end, you'll see that I think we're all talking very similar things. So the approach that I'm taking is I'm going to pitch solutions to you all, and I'm going to provide some evidence, and then we can talk more about it in the discussion to see how you are receptive to my pitches or not. So on the next slide, my first pitch, my first solution is choosing our words carefully. And I know this sounds so small, so trivial. Maybe some of you are sitting there thinking, really, this is what I came here for? Choose your words carefully. But I'm here to tell you that, sometimes we don't think about this more intentionally. And I would really like people to think about it more intentionally and more carefully, especially in the context of aggression. So if you notice here, on the slide, if you really look at this war on science frame started to really pick up. For a few years now, but really started to pick up, especially in the last administration. With the last administration here, you have books that say the Republican war on science or the war on science, and we have news articles, reporting on the war on science, President Trump's war on science, so much war on science. And when we think about war, it's a very aggressive frame. And so, when we're talking about trust, right, that's coming together, sort of having that faith in each other and having, that community, that sense of, trust. And it's very hard to build trust when we're being aggressive in our communication. And we're trying to, I can't think of the right word, but it leads to polarization. And so we want to really remove or reduce that aggression that can lead to polarization and remove frames of ownership of science. And this idea of ownership of science is very popular in, political communication realm, where, for example, you don't have to tell me the answer to this, but think about it. If I said, which political party do you think cares more about foreign relations? I'm sure you have a specific party in mind. When I say, when I think about who cares more about the environment, I'm sure you have a political party that comes to mind. And now what we're seeing with these war on science frames is that there lies this danger of coming across and building this frame as if science is owned by a specific party. And that can be really problematic when we're thinking about building trust and bringing communities together. And so on the next slide is, I think all studies start this way, don't they? So one of my colleagues, Bruce Hardy, who worked on this project with me, posted this on Facebook in 2017, as you can see, an article that came up on Scientific American about how to defeat those who are waging war on science. And if you see another colleague, John Besley, who's at Michigan State, commented saying, step one, we need to figure out, if the war on science conflict frame is our best bet. And he goes on to basically explain, that there's no evidence to really say this. We as communication scholars intuitively understand that a war on science frame is not really good for us, but do we, where's the evidence? And so Bruce responded saying we should do a study together, and that's how the study was born. And I feel like that's how research happens sometimes, we see things in the world and we're passionate about it and we want solutions and evidence. And so on the next slide, I start, talking to you a little bit about how we went about this. So we wanted to explore what is the effect of a war on science frame. And in all my slides at the bottom, there are citations, which, I'm sure they'll be shared with you at some point. So you can look at these things more in depth, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of these things. And so on the next slide, what we explain is this is how our study happened. So we basically had 4 conditions, and the 4 conditions where people were randomly assigned to read one of these articles, and then we asked them, survey questions following, after their exposure to these specific frames. So if you look at frame 1, it's the war on science frame, the frame that we think is the most aggressive. The second one is the challenge for science, and the third one is neglect for science. And we did a pre-test, and we did, find that these are significantly different in terms of how aggressive people find them. And then our fourth frame is who invented baseball. I will admit I am Indian, so I don't understand this fascination for baseball, but apparently that's the American standard control condition. If this was happening in India, it would be, who invented cricket. But, we need a baseline. We need something where we're not priming them to think about science. We just want to know, where they are, just control baseline without reading any of these things. And so on the next slide, we showed them those things. We asked a bunch of questions, but one of the questions that we asked was about scientists' credibility. How credible do you think scientists are? And we asked that in 4 questions with 4 statements. And these are the 4 statements, which essentially is about, do you think scientists' research findings are, keeping the public in mind or keeping themselves in mind or their own agenda or their own political agenda in mind? And so on the next slide, you can see, one of the things that we predicted right in February in 2017 from that Facebook post, where you can see that the war on science frame, the red line is, people who identify as conservative, the green is moderate, and blue is liberal. You can see that, as people were exposed to the war on science frame, or even the challenge or neglect, those aggressive frames, you can see that liberals were more likely to think of scientists as credible compared to conservatives. And you can see the baseball condition. There's not a lot of difference over there. When those lines and those bars areas overlap, there's not really a significant difference over there. They all seem, pretty there. But then the moment they're exposed to these kinds of frames, you can see that polarization happening. And on the next slide, we did not want to assume that just because they were in the war frame, that everybody experienced the aggression on the same level. And so, on that, within the war on science frame, those who thought this frame was more aggressive were also more likely to be split in the end. You can see, where liberals were more favorable towards scientist credibility, whereas conservatives were not, and moderates were right in the middle of it. And so these kinds of, aggressive frames, even though intuitively we know, it's hard to build a community when you're, thinking about framing things very aggressively and polarizingly, this study really helped us understand, wow, we really need to tone it down in terms of aggression whenever possible. And we moved on with the next slide, where we went beyond these aggressive frames and just looked at just general immersion in news and politics, like today's media environment. What are the implications for scientists' credibility? And so on the next slide, I outlined the 3 data sets that we looked at. And these are 3 very large national data sets. 2016 ANES, or the American National Election Survey, 2016 GSS, General Social Survey, 2017 Pew Research Center Survey. And we found results across the board that were all telling us a story. I'm not showing you all the graphs, but I wanted to show you 3 very specific graphs, one from each study. And so in the next slide, this is the GSS graph. And I just want to say, because they're coming from 3 different studies, not all of them ask the questions the same way. So there's a little bit of variation in that, but together they're all really telling the same story. So if you look at this, the more interested people are in politics, the more immersed they are in politics, you can again see the split happening in terms of having positive beliefs with science. And you can see again that divide between liberals and conservatives. On the next slide, you can see with the 2016 ANES study, where the more attention people are paying to politics and news, you can again see how warm or cold they felt towards scientists. And so, the higher the rating on the science thermometer is that you feel warmly about a scientist versus, the lower it is, the colder you feel towards that. But relatively speaking, you can see it's not that, people are feeling too cold about scientists, but it's liberals who are really, getting excited about scientists and science, whereas we're not seeing a lot happening with conservatives over there. And then in the next slide, you can see, with the Pew Research Center, with, positive, in terms of interest in government and politics news and, interest in enjoying and consuming science news, you can still see again that divide happening in terms of, liberals and conservatives. And so one of the takeaway points, the first pitch, going back to it, this is the evidence for that, is this is why I think media, we have a responsibility when we're thinking about how we communicate these messages. And even though it might seem like a very small message, war on science, war, one word, can really convey so much of an emotion and can really be, can create some real difficulties in terms of building that trust and communicating those trusts. So that's my first pitch, is to tone down on the aggression and to tone down on the issue ownership of science. The next slide, I pitched my second solution, which is, again, it might sound really, really simple, but something to think about, is choosing your sources more thoughtfully. So on the next slide, I outline, this study that we did with Mark Linus. Mark Linus was, I remember actually when the story broke, Gina and I were both in grad school when this happened. And Mark Linus was a very popular anti-GM activist, or GM and genetically modified organisms. And he converted. He said, I was wrong, and I am now pro-GMO. And so we wanted to explore what that narrative actually did for people who, considered him part of their group, right? Being activists or being, anti-GMO. So on the next slide, you can see, we tested it based on 3 conditions, where one, we just shared and said Mark Linus is pro-GMO, but then we shared 2 other conditions where he, told and talked about his conversion. And when he talked about his conversion, people found that conversion argument very much, very strong and convincing, which then led to the next slide, where you can see they started having, positive attitudes towards GMOs. And so really thinking about, if you're trying to convince people about a message and you don't know where to start, you might want to think about an in-group member. Now, this can be 2 ways, right? Sometimes that in-group member might be spreading misinformation. So it can go both ways, where, you really have to be thoughtful in that. And then my last third pitch on the next slide is about teaming up a more polarized issue with less polarized issues and being concrete and not abstract about this. So in the same speech that Mark Linus talked about with GMOs, one of the things that he does is he teams talking about GMOs and why we need it with climate change. And we found that when he talked about that, in comparison to messages where he did not make that connection, when he talked about it, people were actually less reactive of the message. They were actually more receptive. And then on the next slide, you can see, that led to them actually being more open to considering that there is scientific consensus on the safety of GMOs. And what is really cool about this, which is on the next slide, is that this was actually something that worked for environmentalists. And so that was a real, stark, point about seeing environmentalists actually, becoming less reactive about GMOs when teamed with climate change. And on this slide, as you can see, another issue that I've seen that we've seen success with is teaming up ocean conservation and climate change. And this is a project that I've been working on, especially in South Carolina, and targeting elementary school kids to elementary school teachers. And, we found a little bit of reluctance among the elementary school teachers in South Carolina with respect to teaching climate change, but that seems to have changed when we team climate change with ocean conservation. So there's something very powerful about, teaming up these kinds of issues and being very concrete. So not just talking about climate change as some abstract concept, but actually grounding it in, bleaching of coral reefs or anything, around, what does the high temperature in the water do to animals? And so that was a really, really cool, finding as well. And we're still exploring some of these things. So on the next slide, just to summarize my pitches, right? Where, reducing aggression to reduce polarization and removing frames of ownership of science. The second pitch being, on the next slide, choosing sources thoughtfully. Think in-group members, opinion leaders can be really powerful. And on the next slide, you can see, teaming up the most polarized issue with the less and grounding it in more concrete details. I like keeping things in 3 because I think people really like things in 3. And so that's where I'm ending this. But on the next slide, I just want to say thank you so much. And you can find me on Twitter, you can email me, but I'm also here for conversation, and hopefully my camera will work. Otherwise, again, I hope my voice can do justice for how excited I am to be here. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, just fantastic. I'm so energized by both of your presentations. Thank you so much. And Meghna, I definitely feel your energy and passion coming through in the tone of your voice. So thank you so much for that enthusiasm. And I know we have already one question. I have one question as well. And you both gave such great suggestions for sort of how to address some of this. And so my first question is for David. You presented some really lovely techniques for how to do the accuracy prompts. And my question is, do those need to be driven by the social media organizations themselves? Or do you see a role for our community, say the National Weather Service, they're posting on social media, our broadcasters who are posting on social media, our private sector companies, Weather Channel, AccuWeather, and more. What role do you see individual organizations playing to help with those accuracy prompts in a social media landscape?
Yeah, totally. So I don't think that this is all. I think the social media platforms have the biggest reach, that is they could snap their fingers and just really implement it. But it's totally not only in their hands. I think any organizations, basically, if when weather events are happening, like having broadcasters, having people on social media saying, hey, everybody, remember, think twice before you share. This is the situation. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of rumors going around. Let's just everyone try and be calm and think carefully about it. If it seems crazy, it probably is. Just basically take a second to do a smell test before you share things. And I think that kind of messaging can achieve the same goal. And I think also an important part of the messaging is saying, remember that when you share something, that has an impact on other people. We have research that shows that just seeing false claims makes people believe them more, even if they're really crazy. And so I think people don't understand that a lot of the time. And so I think that's something that you guys can help create a norm around, of being remember, it's important to think carefully before you share stuff.
That's great, thank you. And a question just came in that's sort of a follow-up to this by Dr. Rick Rosen. Thank you so much for this question. Are accuracy prompts apt to work with climate change, fake news, or are people's perceptions already baked in?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think that basically what the accuracy prompts get people to do is to stop and think, oh, do I think this is actually true before I share it? And so they work for one class of stuff that is basically pretty crazy and pretty obviously not true. But if it's something where your sort of underlying beliefs have gotten really warped by the information that you are exposed to, like in the context of climate change for a lot of people, it probably will be less effective. Although we actually have a paper that we just posted on the effect of getting people to stop and think in terms of their assessment of anti-climate change arguments. And there's a bunch of work along the lines of things that Meghna showed, where if you look at education and things like that, among liberals, education is possibly associated with belief in human-caused climate change, but among conservatives, it's pretty flat and sometimes even the opposite, which people have taken as evidence that people engage in motivated reasoning, and instead of using their brain power to figure out the truth, they just protect their identities and so on. But we actually think that that's not right, and we've done a bunch of work, I think, that really questions that. And instead what it is when people stop and think, okay, so say that you have a new piece of evidence and you have no bias and you're just doing your best to figure out what's true or not. How do you do that? You take everything, all the factual things you know about the world, and you think, how does this new piece of evidence sort of cohere with everything that I already believe? And so what we showed is that getting people to stop and think, that's what it makes them do, is think, how well does this line up with what I already believe? So among Republicans that are climate deniers, getting them to stop and think makes things worse, and then it makes them more accepting of the anti-climate rhetoric. But among Republicans who are climate believers, which in a lot of these studies is a majority of Republicans, is that getting people to stop and think helps. So the helping isn't about your identity, but it is to this question sort of about your pre-existing beliefs about the facts of the world.
That's great. And I can see Meghna nodding, and I think a question too. So I want to allow you an opportunity to respond or ask a question as well.
Excuse me.
I guess I was just curious about, and I'm frozen again, so I'll go off camera, but I was just wondering, David, if part of that was also motivated to do well on a test, you know, the same kind of motivation to do well, I have to get this right, and the moment an accuracy prompt shows up, does that sort of prompt that similar kind of a cognitive process?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess the way that we've thought about it is more like people have an underlying preference, which is, I don't want to share things that are false. And if you knew that something is false, it's like most people will be like, okay, I don't want to share it. But that preference basically stays latent, sort of like unrealized, because people forget to even think about it. I use this metaphor of there's like a spotlight of attention. And particularly when you're scrolling quickly through your feed, that spotlight is pretty narrow. And so you're only thinking about the one or the other thing that's in the spotlight. And so if you just kind of swing that spotlight back over towards accuracy, people are more likely to think, oh yeah, right. Like, you know, accuracy, I should think about that. Yeah. That's
great. Thank you. There's another, since we're on this same topic, Nora Randall asked a question. Oh, I just lost it. 1 second. How often do we need to do these sort of accuracy prompts? Like, how long is the effect of sort of thinking about accuracy once you see that prompt?
It's a great question. It's one of the main open questions that we don't really have a good answer for. There are various limitations of the experimental approaches we use that mean we can't really get a good sense. And our hope is basically that we see what we've done so far as a proof of concept, that then we hope the platforms who can do these massive experiments at scale can really sort that out. But my vision is it's not something like that. I'm sure it doesn't last that long. And my vision is it's not like this is something where you do it once and then you're good, but rather the point is the social media context has created an environment in which people are chronically not paying attention to accuracy. And so we, like as a society and the companies in particular, need to do work to try to change that context so that in a sort of systemic way, people are more paying attention to accuracy.
This is great. Thank you. I want to go back to a really important question from one of our community members, Alec Krautman. And he asks the following. So this is for both of you. With never before seen impacts from climate change and record-breaking weather events, such as Hurricane Harvey, for example, with the extreme rainfall amounts, what are some strategies for communicating information that should otherwise legitimately seem unbelievable? So for example, for Hurricane Harvey, when we were getting forecasts in and model information coming in of 40 inches, 50 inches, 60 inches of rain, even our own forecasters were going, wow, we've never seen these amounts before. They seem unbelievable, and yet it is actually part of an accurate forecast. Another example given here was from the Louisiana flooding event in 2016. He was particularly struck by all the calls they were getting early in the event, asking if this record-breaking Weather Service Rivercrest forecasts were real. And so I guess suggestions or tips from either of you on how, communication strategies.
I don't know, Megan, do you want to go first?
It's such a great question. And also there, I think I keep going back to thinking about being abstract versus concrete, because I think sometimes when things are communicated in these large amounts, for someone who is not familiar with what it is and there's no context or no analogy or no comparison, it can seem so big and unreal. And it might be big, but also at the same time, it might create some level of fear or some level of lack of, not knowing what to do with it. And so I think there are two things here. One is sort of maybe using analogies or some way to sort of give an example to sort of make sense of something so big or something so huge, but also not leaving it there. And this is where I think the fear versus threat comes in, where if you don't tell people how to handle it and what to do with it, and I feel like I'm seeing Matt nodding, so I feel like I'm going in the right direction over here. where if you don't feel like, you're giving them something to grasp onto and do or be prepared for, then that's just going to sit with them and not be productive. And so, you want to make use of something that is so huge and real, but grounded in a way that can seem, still, I am still part of this and I can do something about it. Hopefully that's in line with the science. I want to say that.
Matt, I think you actually had a response or question, comment to that.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say was about giving people something to compare to. One of the things that happened after Hurricane Harvey with us is we had a sort of a conversation. So the other person I work with on this blog, Eric Berger, we were discussing how can we in the future better frame up what people can expect? Because I mean, here in Houston, you can have one thunderstorm that dumps 10 inches of rain on one place and nobody else gets anything. And it's sunny and it floods in one place and other places see, nothing at all. So we wanted to come up with a way to express this, but there was really no way to do it. So we created a flood scale. And I kind of like sat back when we started to do that and I kind of winced in my chair a little bit because I've always been sort of taught like we want to respect the National Weather Service and what they forecast. We don't want to go and create any friction with them because maybe there's going to be a time where we're a little more aggressive or less aggressive than what, they're saying. But I sort of got over it to the point where like, look, we have viewers that want something concrete to compare to. And if we can create a flood scale, give them a number 1 to 5, put events in there that were like, that would qualify that people will remember, that were recent or not recent, historical, then they can have something to sort of base their ground their expectations on. And I mean, we really haven't had to test it too much in situ yet, but we found so far the few times that we have used it, I mean, now we have people asking us for it. They want to know, they want to be able to know this is not going to be Harvey that's coming. This is not going to be Allison that's coming. And I think in a place like Houston's kind of unique in the sense that something like that can work, which, I think creates interesting ideas for other places that have other challenges and hazards to deal with.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The one quick thing that I would add in terms of like how do you make crazy seeming things seem credible relates to something that Meghna touched on in her talk, which is sources. Basically, if you can get some credible source, like a source that people really trust to say, like whether that's the Weather Channel or like specific people that are seen as experts, whatever, to say, look, I know this seems crazy, but it's real. I think that will go a long way.
What a great exchange. I love it. I wish we had even more time. I know we have 4 minutes left, so there's another really great question in here from Timothy Hall. And he says the following: fake news can be viewed as propaganda. Propaganda weaves together truth and fiction or colors a message received through clever wording to support a narrative of a certain perspective, an agenda, for example. It has become widely suspected that social media and mainstream news outlets are not consistently motivated to emphasize accuracy or objective truth, but rather to increase click rate or help to engineer greater social cultural political change. Complicating the equation, people wonder who can be trusted as a fact checker now. The research as presented suggests that a key pathway to address fake news is to promote critical thinking by individuals. So here are a couple of questions. Is it possible that efforts to promote critical thinking won't mitigate our collective vulnerability to propaganda? And the second question, sorry for the double-barreled, but I'm gonna get you thinking. Can operators or platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, be trusted to be accountable, not promoting a specific social, cultural, political agenda? Can these platforms be trusted to act as arbiters of truth and accuracy? What a powerful question.
Yeah, so I guess I would say on the critical thinking part, we have done a bunch of research that in general, getting people to engage in more critical thinking makes them less likely to believe false claims, and particularly less likely to believe things that don't align with their factual beliefs about the world. But it's also certainly the case that if they're continually getting exposed to bad information, that will have a cumulative effect, because we find also, as I mentioned, just getting exposed to false information makes you believe it more, and critical thinking does not protect against that. I think because the critical thinkers sort of remember it better, and so even though they may be less likely to use familiarity as a rule of thumb, it feels more familiar because they think more. Whatever. Anyway, so the point is, critical thinking is good, but you also really want to try and reduce exposure in the first place. And in terms of the platforms, being able to trust the platforms, I mean, no, right? But like also, I don't know, there's not much of an alternative in other than applying public pressure to them. There's the possibility of regulation, but I'm sort of nervous about the regulators really understanding things well enough to know what's going on. But I think a partial solution to this, we don't want them to be the arbiters of the truth, is we've been doing a bunch of work showing that crowdsourcing is actually pretty good for identifying the accuracy of content. If you just get a bunch of lay people to gut check headlines, that lines up pretty well with the research results of professional fact checkers, which is probably surprising because you think like people don't know anything. But this is the magic of the wisdom of crowds, is even though any individual person is not great, if you get a bunch of people and average them, all the mistakes kind of average out, and the crowd can really do surprisingly well. So we have a paper or a couple of papers showing the promise of that. And then it's not really in the hands of the platforms, but rather the crowd.
That's great. Thank you, David. Magna, any comments or last points? Seeing 4:59, we're down to seconds.
I know I'm late. I guess the only thing I will add is that I know it's not a it's a very frustrating thing to see so much misinformation on these websites. But I just want to say that I think we need some of these things to see what's even happening. I mean, it's hard to correct misinformation if you don't even know what the misinformation is. And so having some of these platforms provides us with that spot, and, you know, engaging in that critical debate. I mean, you know, you're able to witness that. And I think if you don't see that, we can't think of solutions. So I think we are in that place. And I think, you know, I don't know whose role or who the attribution of responsibility falls on, but I'm very glad that we're actually thinking about this and thinking about solutions for it. So that's my last spiel.
Thank you so much. And I could envision a study 4 years from now with a number of accuracy prompts. We'll begin to see scientist credibility going up in those Pew Research studies. So Dr. David Rand and Dr. Magna Talapragada, thank you so much. And perhaps there's a partnership here of a paper in just a few years. Heidi, back to you.
Oh, Gina, thank you. David, Magna, Maureen, Matt, thank you so much. I'm really hoping Jen invites us back for part 2 in person next year. This has been amazing conversations. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we'll try to follow up after. Jen, back to you to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Heidi. And thank you to you and Gina for bringing us an engaging panel on scientific integrity. Many of you may have noticed that over the past couple of years, we have maintained a steady focus on the theme of scientific integrity, and we intend to do so going forward. Scientific integrity is important to our entire community, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you ascribe to. So I am proud that we have continued that drumbeat, and Heidi, you can bet we will look to that for 2022 as well. All right, we're here. It's been a wonderful 4 days. A big thank you to the entire program committee for their dedication. The keynote and sessions generated robust dialogue and offered food for thought. I ask that you indulge me for a few more minutes as I take the time to thank a number of important people, and then I promise I'll let you go. First, I'd like to thank the AMS staff for their outstanding efforts in making this event a success. The AMS Meetings Department, including Megan Summers, Christine Carr, Jen Ives, Adam Kelly, and Keith Sider. They did a tremendous job making these meetings happen and ensuring things run smoothly. Plus, they graciously take my last-minute calls and texts, so I thank them. I'd also like to thank John Bryant and Josh Clark for the behind-the-scenes tech support. As I am not a text person, I can honestly say that without them, this whole thing would have been a disaster, so thank you. Next, I would like to again thank our generous sponsors, Lockheed Martin, the Aerospace Corporation, AccuWeather, KBR, General Dynamics Information Technology, Ball Aerospace, Millersville University, Earth Networks, Commodity Weather Group, Vaisala, IBS Corporation, and IMS Systems Group. And a special thank you to our AMS premier sponsor, Magna. As this is a team effort, I would be truly remiss if I did not call out the following as wonderful partners in this endeavor, and truly this forum is a success because of them and their efforts over the last 6 months. Steve Bennett, Jack Cahill, Heidi Santola, Rich Clark, John Cousins, Pam Ench, Gina Esco, Jeffrey Friedman, Larry Gleckler, Erica Groh, Doug Hildebrand, Bill Hook, Eli Jacks, Carmen Jenkins, Renee Ledoux, Andrea Lopez Lang, Chris Lauer, Jeff Lazo, Yaitza Luna Cruz, Scott McCarroll, Bill Mahoney, Andrew Markowitz, Sean Miller, Amanda Mitchell, Paul Pisano, Ralph Rayner, Clarice Rary, Keith Sutter, John Tenhove, Eric Wertz, and John Zach, the majority of my bead crew, but also other folks that have helped us put this together and all these great panels. A special thank you to Heidi Santola. Heidi is a tremendous asset to our enterprise. She is the cheerleader that we sometimes desperately need, and she has been the understated encouragement when we all want to say, Thank you, Heidi, for being steadfast in your support of this enterprise. I'm delighted that you're my colleague, but I'm also proud to call you my friend. Finally, I'd like to thank the AMS and the community that we have created, a community of thought, wisdom, and inclusion, especially at a time when we need that most. I am proud to be part of this community, and thank you for welcoming me into your fold and allowing me to be part of this great enterprise. I hope that 2022 brings us the opportunity to be in person. Until then, stay safe and enjoy the coming summer. That's it. Mic's dropped. Have a great night. Thank you.